This is an oral history with Jan Pilcher, and we're meeting in her home in South Denver, and we're going to be discussing Rocky Flats and her work with it. And this is for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum and the Carnegie Library Oral History Project, the Maria Rogers Oral History Project. And thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you. Do you wish me to look at you or at the camera?
Me is
okay,
just
better.
as good.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll stand up and pop up every now and then and check.
Okay. Do you need to run that through again since I asked that question?
No.
Or? Okay.
This is an informal kind
Okay.
of thing. Yeah. So the question I said I would ask first of all is, when and where were you born?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a post-World War II baby. Born right after the war. I was born September 24th, 1947 in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And can you tell me a little bit about what your family was like in your growing up years?
Yeah, it had a large part to do with the Cold War, actually. My mother grew up in the Escalante Desert outside of Cedar City, Utah, on a ranch. It was the last available land that could be homesteaded in the United States. It was desolate prairie. And my grandfather, who ran the general store and pretty much ran a little town called Lund, Utah, that was on the rail line, tried to raise sheep. And this was on the Nevada-Utah border. And my mother grew up the only non-Mormon family in Mormon country, and couldn't wait to get away from the desolation and poverty of the Depression. And she went to private school because there was no school after the 8th grade in her small rural community. So she went to Wasatch Academy and then to Westminster College, where she studied nursing because it was World War II. And that's where she met my father, at a dance. My father was born in the Dust Bowl in the worst part of the Depression in Muskogee, Oklahoma. My father was the town doctor, and my grandfather was the town doctor and surgeon. He also was the doctor for the Cherokee Nation, based in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. But people couldn't afford to pay the doctors money in those days, so they dropped chickens and eggs at their doorstep. And that's how my father and his 6 other siblings survived the Depression. So World War II was his ticket out of Muskogee. He was in the Air Force. He was a bombardier and navigator, and he flew 35 missions over Germany during World War II, based out of an air base north of London. During his training, he was in Mountain Home, Idaho, and since there were no women up there, they flew them down to Salt Lake City for mixers and dances, and that's where he fell in love with my mother, whom he barely knew. He was so in love with her, I think it kept him alive when he lost a lot of his buddies in World War II, who got hit by flak and the Germans. And he came directly home and he married a woman he didn't know very well. And he took her back to Oklahoma. And they lived in Tulsa, where he went to school on the GI Bill, the only sibling in his family who was able to go to college because of the GI Bill. He had a lot of sisters. And so World War II had a lucky impact. It resulted in my being born and my father getting an education and having a successful career.
And then, did you grow up in Tulsa?
Yes, we grew up in Tulsa, and then we moved to Oklahoma City when I was about 5, to Dallas when I was 9, and then on a trip through the West, because we went to go visit my grandparents, which is what most people did for vacations in the 1950s. You didn't go to Paris or Italy, you went to your grandparents. So we would drive across the American West, and we were going through Colorado, and my father felt that Denver was a city on the up and up, and he decided to start his own business for the first time in his life. He was in wholesale plumbing and heating supplies, and then he moved on into real estate, building development, and later bought the Hotel Colorado, an historic hotel in Glenwood Springs. So I have a little bit of all of that in my background. So I did most of my growing up in Denver from the age of 9. We moved here in 1956 to Denver, and I was 9. But the interesting fact was that my grandparents continued to live in Lund, Utah, out in the Escalante Desert. That's not the Escalante Canyonlands, but further west in Utah. And we went to visit them in the summers. My uncle, my mother's brother, lived on the ranch with the aging parents. He was a prisoner of war in Japan in World War II. Came back very gaunt and haunted, and was a uranium miner during the Cold War era. Smoked heavily, was lonely, and died very suddenly in 1955. No one knows what of. My father said he died of a broken heart. The next thing that happened was in 1956 my grandmother died, and we went out for her funeral to the ranch, and we were awakened one morning by a blast and were levitated off of our beds, and it was a nuclear weapons explosion in 1956. So I got to see a nuclear bomb go off. So the Cold War was right in my face. It was
Do you
a thing.
remember what you felt then?
I felt fear. We had no idea what it was because they didn't inform people in those communities about what was going on. And I'm sure we were all showered with radiation. There were very high levels of leukemia in the children in Cedar City and in St. George, Utah, which were a little bit actually further east from where we were. The sheep of the ranchers in the area where my grandfather was working had their fur burned off, and some of them died. And the leukemia showed it fairly quickly because children, I guess, are more affected by radiation than adults, and things showed up sooner in terms of blood damage. So I later went back in 1979. I wanted to be a freelance journalist, and I was able to get into the homes of families who had lost children. And it was 20 years later, and it was still an open, bleeding wound. So that was my background. Just to stop for a minute there, I'm getting an echo here. Is that?
Yes, I was wondering, is there some noise outside? Let me
Can we
just
stop for a second?
stop this, yes. We'll start again now.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
just
yeah.
pick up.
yeah.
Yeah. I don't hear any echo now. do
No,
you?
okay, yeah. So I was one of those people who actually saw a nuclear weapon go off. And it was just at this time that we moved to Denver. And I actually heard about Rocky Flats when I was 9 years old, although it was never in the media, because I was in a Brownie troop at the age of 9 when we moved to Denver, and spent a lot of time at the Brownie troop's house because she loved children. We baked brownies there, and we learned how to do photographs. Her husband was a worker at Rocky Flats, so that's how I heard the word. This was in 1957 when the first big fire happened at the plant, which was never, if it was reported in the newspapers, I wasn't reading the newspapers then. But it was the first time I'd ever seen an atomic chart, and it was on his wall down in the basement where we had all of our meetings. And he was a scientist, so he had a darkroom. And a worker at Rocky Flats taught me how to take pictures and develop them in his darkroom in a little teeny, very modest neighborhood in southwest Denver. So at the same time, I was going to elementary school at Anna Laura Force Elementary School. And like all schools in Denver, we had duck and cover drills in the event of a nuclear weapon being dropped. And we had to run down into the basement and get into duck and cover position. And that was supposedly going to save us from a nuclear weapon going off. We were also passed out literature that we took home about stockpiling water and crackers, and people started building bomb shelters at that time. And actually, in my high school years, we moved to another neighborhood, and the neighbors next door did have a bomb shelter that I looked out on every morning when I woke up because it had a ventilation pipe coming out of it. These days, it's a wine cellar. So the other thing that was that is haunting and really probably fueled me to become an activist was I had one particular teacher who was obsessed with the idea that we would have a nuclear war. And we would be in the middle of a test or doing work, and he would take a ruler out of his desk and crack it down on the table, and the noise was to make us automatically get into duck and cover position under our desks. If parents these days knew that was going on, that teacher would have been fired. But he was a good teacher otherwise, but we were all a little obsessed. And I have talked about this with my childhood friend, and it's deeply embedded in us.
This was in high school then?
This was in elementary school.
Elementary school. Mhm.
At the same time, unbelievably, we had lists passed out to our parents with evacuation routes to get out of Denver in the 15 minutes we would have to evacuate an entire metropolitan area through US 6, which was a 2-lane highway that was later replaced by 4 to 6-lane Interstate 70. But even I, at 9 years old, figured out that this was a ruse. An entire city of perhaps, I don't know, what were there, 300,000-400,000 people in Denver at that time, were not going to be able to get out a 2-lane highway into the mountains in 15 minutes while a nuclear missile was headed our way. Now, why there would be a nuclear missile headed our way, I didn't know. But we had Rocky Flats here. So that was the first phase, my childhood.
Yes, yes. So then, did you go on to finish high school here
Yes.
and then college?
I graduated from Thomas Jefferson High School in 1965,
Uh-huh.
and I went on to a women's college in the East Coast, Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts.
Mhm.
And the second major phase in my life that had to do with the Cold War happened during my sophomore year at Mount Holyoke, which would have been about 1966. A movie came out that simulated the impact of a nuclear weapon detonating in London. And I'm blanking out on the name of it. It was showed on college campuses, and it basically just showed rubble everywhere. It was another Hiroshima. And at the end, there's some children wandering around amongst the waste and desolation, and there's one porcelain toilet standing up out of the ruins. And the BBC interviewer comes up and said to the kids, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And the kids, with blank eyes, said nothing. It was the end of culture and civilization. I will think of the name of this movie. It was horrific. My girlfriend, Jan Harris, and I, who saw that, were forever changed. So that was probably the first time as an adult I realized what nuclear war could mean. But it was the late 60s, and it was sex, drugs, rock and roll, and by 68, people were, burning down college campuses. Not Mount Holyoke, no politics happened there. I did have a boyfriend at Dartmouth, and there was a lot happening there. A lot happening. There was a lot of protest around the anti-war movement, the concern about Vietnam.
Did you participate in any
Yes,
activism?
but in the summer of '68, when it was all happening in Chicago, I was traveling around Europe with a friend and reading about it in the newspapers, and sorry I wasn't in Chicago. I did have friends in Chicago and friends who got arrested, and I was very opposed to the Vietnam War. Which reminds me, I had an uncle at the time who was a reporter and journalist here at the Denver Post. So I have to backtrack to say that when I was about 9 or 10 years old, he wrote a centerpiece article on what would happen if Denver was the bullseye in the event of a nuclear weapons attack, which my parents probably threw in the trash can so I wouldn't read, but I did read, and it talked about the same devastation I later saw with this movie in college. But I had a lot of anti-war sentiment probably building up as a child. And maybe it was the Cold War stuff and all the stuff about war that made Vietnam so much more abhorrent to my generation. But we really spoke out against authority, because the whole point of the 50s was to be patriotic and not to question your country, so that the whole Department of Defense could go on and do things that ultimately harmed our populace in secrecy. And I think the big break in the 60s was that we spoke out. And we wanted information. And we knew the government was lying to us when the Pentagon Papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg, who later came here to Rocky Flats and sat on the railroad tracks in the first acts of civil disobedience in 1977.
Yes. Now, in your family, did your family encourage you to think about politics or become activist, or what? How?
Oh no, I think the 60s were a big break for a lot of families. My father was a decorated World War II veteran, and my mother came from conservative Utah, and they were shocked and horrified by my anti-war stance, and I was a traitor to my country. And it's funny, after we saw this bomb go off in the 1950s in the Nevada test site, that was never talked about. There were all these family secrets. So I wrote about it in a short story that I've never showed them, about this thing we never talked about. You just didn't question things, and you were patriotic. And I understand where my father came from. I mean, Hitler was terrible. What the Nazis did was abhorrent for the entire planet. It was a black mark against civilization. But that level of patriotism carried on to a war where I don't think that analysis worked. So we had a real break in my family, and I wore a black armband at my graduation, as did most of my class, to protest the war. And I don't think my parents spoke to me during my graduation. So, and I later fell in love with a conscientious objector who was banned from the family. And so that caused a lot. There was a lot of major breaks. And I will say that my mother came around in 1975 during the evacuation of the orphans and soldiers from Saigon. With all the retrospectives that went on, she said I was wrong, which was one of the few times in my life I felt vindicated by my mother. But it caused, I was the oldest of 3 children, and I was really the political activist in the family. I was 10 years older than my sister, actually, and so it was a real break in the family. And this was prior to my getting very involved in the anti-nuclear movement.
So then you finished college, and what did you do then?
I left everything behind and went to Aspen for a year and skied. And the culture was alive and well in Aspen. There was the Aspen Institute. I met people involved with that. So it wasn't exactly a ski bum year, because I met a number of people involved with the Aspen Institute in the arts. And I think everything you do comes back to you later in life to haunt you or help you. I guess it's karma, as we said in the 60s. But all my years skiing, I had a lot of insights into the ski industry, and I later became the public relations director for Colorado Ski Country USA. So I represented 34 ski areas nationally, and I placed stories in both the travel and business and entertainment media in national magazines and newspapers. So I got to travel around the U.S., and I learned all about the media business and placing stories, a skill that later was very useful in the anti-nuclear movement.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you work in that?
I left Aspen after a year because there was nothing to do professionally there. And I had a really good education. My father was really disturbed after paying 4 years of private tuition at a liberal arts college for his daughter to become a ski bum and maid, which is what everybody did in Aspen. So I had met a photographer and a journalist while I was in Aspen who had just traveled around the world in a VW van. So I sold everything I owned and went to Asia for a year and a half and traveled around Asia by myself. And I was able to go to Vietnam during the war in 1971. The law professor and his wife I had lived with while I was in graduate school for a year at the University of Colorado, after I finished Mount Holyoke, adopted a baby from Vietnam. They were having some trouble getting her out, and they actually, since they knew I was going to Asia, they asked if I would go to Saigon to the orphanage where she was at and just make sure things were okay and help with paperwork. So I did about a 3-week detour, perhaps longer, to Saigon. Mm-hmm. I stayed in Saigon. I was a volunteer in an orphanage there run by 2 Australian women who had to beg on the streets. There were a lot of babies left on the doorsteps of orphanages in those days. And the baby that Stephen and Hope adopted was half black. The father was an American soldier, and half Vietnamese. And a lot of those babies were abandoned because of racial proclivities of the Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. The baby was wall to wall. The babies were wall to wall in little metal cribs, and there was not a silence in the whole orphanage because they never got picked up, so they never cried. And these 2 incredible Australian women would go out in the daytime and beg for food so that they could feed all these babies. And the other thing I did in Saigon is I spent time in the bar ski unit, because I walked around door to door to find a place to stay. And there was a woman, I think she was funded by World Vision, who ran the bar ski unit, a Japanese-funded surgery unit in Cholan, the North Vietnamese kind of Chinese sector of Saigon. And so I got to see really innovative plastic surgery being done on children. It'd build tubes of flesh to rebuild parts of their body that had blown away. There was a lot of secondary damage from bombs left in the ground and secondary incendiary stuff and all the gases that were used in napalm and stuff. There were a lot of wounds from that.
So you saw a lot of the problems of the war.
So if I wasn't a peace activist before, 1 month in Vietnam sealed my fate. Yeah. It was the most powerful experience of my life. It made me ashamed for my country, horrified that a civilized time in history such as ours could continue to commit such atrocities on harmless populations of women and children. And it will be burning in my heart until the day I die. So I traveled around Southeast Asia for a year and a half by myself. I made my way across the Middle East alone. Pakistan was one of the most difficult places I've ever traveled. I had an exit visa. I had to go quickly because there had been a war between Pakistan and India. And the Swiss negotiated a passage for all the young backpackers like myself to walk across to no man's land and to get on trains and get out of Pakistan. But I had my first taste of the Middle East and the difficulties there. I was completely unprepared. I knew nothing about Islam. I only knew that they didn't like females traveling alone, and I was tall and blonde, and I had a lot of difficulties. So I made my way eventually to London, where I lived for a year. I did not want to return home because of the American policies in Vietnam. But I ran out of money and a visa, so I eventually had to come home. And I decided to do pre-med because of the wonderful work I had seen doctors doing in Saigon. And I did pre-med for a year and a half. So post-BA, I went back and did an undergraduate to get the courses I needed to do medical training. And ultimately, since I was getting up into my 30s, I decided I was too old to go to medical school. I did get into a wonderful physician's assistant program here in town, and I guess a lifelong regret is that I didn't do that, because I think I would have loved medicine. But all of those biology courses I took, and all of those very difficult organic and inorganic chemistry courses, later came to help me when I did work when I did work about the medical impacts of nuclear weapons production on workers and the general public. So the lesson here once again was everything you do, even if it seems irrelevant, comes back and feeds in at some other point in your life. So that undergraduate medical work was very helpful in the Rocky Flats work, which came later.
So then, when did you begin to get involved or aware of and active with respect to Rocky Flats?
Well, I was sitting on a door stoop in about 1972, living in the house of this law professor and his wife, and doing a postgraduate year at the University of Colorado, where I got a teaching certificate. And I read an article in the back pages of the newspaper about a man, I believe out of Philadelphia, who was an epidemiologist, doing studies and finding patterns of high incidence of leukemia in children in places where the fallout had come down. His name escapes me at the moment, although it was a very seminal moment, because I kept thinking about all the families in Utah, including my own family, that had exposure to fallout from nuclear weapons above ground testing. And that stuck with me. And in about 1976 or 77, 2 nuclear weapons were detonated on the western slope of Colorado at Rulison. They were looking for ways to free up oil in the oil shell, in a very rich oil shell country. This is in the west slope of Colorado, west of Glenwood Springs and Rifle, Colorado. And I was outraged that they were detonating nuclear weapons again, even if they were underground. I was absolutely outraged. And that fed into this article I read about nuclear fallout and its issues. And it turns out that there were fissures from that, but in the ventilation pipes from these underground explosions, there was radioactive krypton and radioactive gases being exposed. Even though these were supposed to be completely safe, and these were the spin-offs from nuclear weapons technology for peacetime uses. And somehow, through the hand of the divine, I was led to Rocky Flats, the Rocky Flats Action Group, RFAG, headed up by Maury Wolfson. Maury Wolfson is one of the most important people in this movement in my eyes. He was Denver's first environmentalist. He came back from the University of San Francisco and founded Environmental Action in Colorado, and was one of the early people working on Rocky Flats, requesting and doing soil sampling, looking for radionuclides in the soil downwind from Rocky Flats. Because by this time, by 1957 and 1969, there had been 2 big fires that melted the radiation monitors and resulted in big off-site releases, although we never knew how much. So in 1977, I joined Rocky Flats in a small band of 6 or 8 people, and we started researching. We researched documents. We started some education. We developed a slideshow. We wrote a little thing called the Rocky Flats newsletter, Rocky Flats Action newsletter. John Boak, a local artist, did the design for it. I was a high school journalism teacher at this point, so I put it all together. I wrote the pieces and I laid it out. In those days, you glued things down and they photocopied it, and there was nothing computer in those days, nothing computer-oriented, so we all did it in the old, funky, old-fashioned ways. And that
So
came
you were
out.
teaching school as your
I was
regular
teaching
job.
high school English journalism and working on the side with this little action group, and those were exciting years.
Mhm.
We had a lot of meetings at the home of Jock Cobb, who was working at the University of Colorado Medical School, and he was turned on to epidemiology, later hooked up with Dr. Carl Johnson, who did the first really serious epidemiological studies in the area. So there was a lot of stuff brewing in the late 70s. In 1977, we organized, in conjunction with the Rocky Mountain Peace Center in Boulder.
Yes.
Is that what it is, the Rocky
Yes.
Mountain Peace
Mhm.
Center? We organized a huge demonstration at Rocky Flats that was very successful. And that's when the civil disobedience started. People sat on the railroad tracks to prevent trains coming in. They picked up mixed radioactive waste and brought in stuff from Savannah River and other places. And I did not sit out on the tracks.
Did you participate in the demonstration?
I participated in the planning of the demonstrations, but I did not do civil disobedience out on the tracks. I didn't want to be in jail. I felt I was a real mainstream activist that felt I could do better work being a spokesperson, doing the research and the writing, and I had other obligations. I don't know, I don't think I was married by the late 70s, but I had other things to do. There were people who did hardcore activism, and there were people that did more behind-the-lines work, and probably I was more a behind-the-lines worker then. But I was immensely inspired by Daniel Ellsberg and Judy Danielson and Pam Solo. Pam and Judy were working at the American Friends Service Committee, and they initiated the Rocky Flats project, and they were the quiet, unsung heroes. Pam Solo was a nun in those days with the Sisters of Loretto, a very activist group of nuns, and she was one of those quiet strategists who saw the big picture and later founded the Nuclear Freeze campaign. And my heart goes out to her for laying the groundwork for all the rest of us. So I met all these wonderful, visionary, extremely well-educated people who didn't just see the local details, but saw the larger picture of the cost of nuclear weapons production in the United States in terms of resources diverted to war instead of peace, and the harmful effects of weapons production on a populace that wasn't allowed to know what was going on. Secrecy issues were really a violation of our democratic rights. And we were paying a huge price for nuclear weapons production in terms of environmental contamination and public health.
Now, you mentioned that Maury Wolfson had a big influence on you. Can you speak a little bit to that?
He put in my hands The Great American War Machine by Roger Rappaport, a book that I memorized. And it was about the nuclear weapons complex and the cost of nuclear weapons production. A seminal piece of reading. It's probably not even in print anymore. And Maury had the solar energy bookstore up at Colfax and Josephine above some bar. And it was the hangout. It was where all the earlier activists went, and he was a strategist. He was the first true environmental activist in this area, and he taught me everything. He was a strategist who got out on the front lines and made things happen. And he plotted things out, and he, without being paid, educated this whole generation of people like me who had grown up in the Cold War and had the fire in our belly and didn't quite know how to get started or what to do. And he was my mentor in the finest sense of mentor. And I'm still a very close personal friend. When he later married, I became friends with his wife. She's my daughter's godmother. And they're wonderful people still. And Maury's still out there. He's promoting responsible energy policy with renewables now, and is as fervent, as passionate as ever. But he educated a whole generation of people, and he ran all these interns from the University of Colorado at Denver. They had a public policy program, a master's in public policy, and he organized internships for a lot of those students who were in and out of his office, and he had something for everybody to do, and he was a mile a minute. And I feel he was very important in this movement. And I don't know if he got as much attention as perhaps some of the early organizers, and I don't know, he was not another one. He was another one like myself who did not sit on the tracks and do the out front civil disobedience, but he really made things happen. He was an intellectual. He was a strategist and an organizer. He knew how to pull people together and to animate them and give them visions and give them specific tasks. I think he identified me as a journalist early on, so I got to do the newspaper that came out once a month.
So is that how you began to?
Mhm. And we did this little publication that I still have in my, I could bring it out, Local Hazard Global Threat. It was the first piece we did. It was about, what, 40 or 50 pages. And we kind of were the first people to lay out the history of Rocky Flats and the terrible environmental hazards around the two big fires they had. Because we realized it wasn't just day-to-day emissions from the stacks, things that got through the HEPA filters, but two big fires that melted all the HEPA filters and had unmeasured releases flowing off-site when the government was telling us everything was okay and it was safe. With the first fire, they were back in production 2 days later because they had production quotas to meet. And the fire monitors were all melted down and people weren't doing measurements of how much got off-site. Even though I think the local schools in Jefferson County south of the plant were shut down for a day or two, which was good. In 1969, we had a much larger fire with much, I think something like 22,000 pounds of plutonium were burned. The plant was closed down for several months for a cleanup. We knew no people were going in radiation suits. All the glove boxes and the pipes that vented it were all destroyed and melted in one of the buildings. And I think somebody did some outside measurements and found thousands of times background levels of radiation. And I would have been in college. That was in the spring of 1969. That was just before I graduated. But I was here during the 1957 fire. I lived on the west side, and I was probably one of the millions of children here who got irradiated. Not millions, but hundreds of thousands. So, you know, you wonder if you have your own time bomb ticking inside you. My mother did get cancer. She survived, but she had a very rough time of it. She got cancer in the late 70s. And she, with me, was out there in the desert when that first bomb went off. So you always wonder.
Getting back, you said that you started doing media work.
Yes.
With respect to this little Rocky Flats group, did you work with the media then?
We wrote our own little newspaper and we generated our own little stories and we worked off what we could get from press releases at the plant, because the plant, it was all good news emanating from the plant. But little things were starting to come out. There were little reports. There was a monthly monitoring committee meeting with the health department, which kind of went along, things bumped along. We started attending those meetings and looking to see if there were documents we could get things out of. But we weren't really actively placing stories. I think they were going after the civil disobedience. And the civil disobedience was the way we had media attention.
How did you feel about that?
I was glad that the civil disobedience was a good way to open up the public's eyes. But unfortunately, the media likes the most colorful characters. These days they'd be tattoos, but they were all strung up with jewelry and the long hair and bell bottoms and, you know, people who were living in tents and teepees. And, you know, there were a lot of kind of people like me who were more middle class who were also fervently concerned. But I think the people that the media covered who were more colorful were turning off the mainstream citizens who lived around the plant. But that was to change in the 1980s. So in my own life story, I was on the board of the American Friends Service Committee Rocky Flats Committee, and we had planning meetings at Jock Cobb's house. And so I got into kind of planning with some more well-versed people like Jock, who had a medical background. And Carl Jensen did not come to those meetings, but he gave us input, and we did have meetings with him. Pam Solo and Judy Danielson were very involved, and then Tom Rao came in. And the American Friends Service Committee was kind of the leader that was giving some money to programming at that time. The Rocky Flats Action Group was a separately funded independent group. We didn't even have any funding. We were all just volunteers. And so I had actually a membership on that program board. That was good. Just about that time, I married my husband, who came with 3 little teeny kids. And I moved from teaching journalism to my first really big job, ill paid as it was, doing public relations without really any training in public relations for the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry. I had been doing some freelance journalism, and I'd had a media job at the School of Mines on a contract basis. And so I somehow wiggled my way into this job promoting the skiing industry to the nation and to Europe. So I got to work a little bit with the European press that found Colorado a sexy, jazzy place to ski, and I got to meet with business reporters because, like Rocky Flats, skiing brought a lot of money into the state. And I got to work with editors and reporters, and I sold our story nationally. Skills that later came in very handy. In 1985, I had continued my Rocky Flats work on the side while raising little children, and I moved over to being a part-time and then later full-time volunteer with Rocky Flats at the American Friends Service Committee. And it was a quiet time. Pam Solo had moved on. There was the nuclear freeze movement. I think Judy Danielson got married and had some kids too, and the Rocky Flats Action Group was kind of chugging along. Things were quiet. And so I started working with Tom Rao. They gave me a desk at the American Friends Service Committee. And I started going to meetings and monitoring emissions. And then something called CEARP, C-E-A-R-P came along. It may have been EPA required governmental stuff where they started having to do some documentation and advanced planning, draft releases on what they would do for cleanup and for releases and for how they were going to handle all the ponds, the holding ponds that had plutonium in the water that would then flow off into Stanley Lake or Great Western Reservoir. And Howard Holmes had a lawsuit cooking with nearby landowners who were concerned about their property values because of contamination of the plant. By this time, the plant had bought a whole lot of acreage around as a buffer zone so that you couldn't have, the population was rapidly expanding and people wanted to develop right up to the plant site, so a buffer zone was instigated. But all these were little bubbling things and there wasn't too much publicity. So it was a quiet time in terms of that. And my role at that time was to take a slideshow that had been initially prepared by Pam Solo and Judy Danielson, but I had all these media and public relations skills. And I actively took it out to 100 groups in the Denver area.
Oh. What kind of groups?
Neighborhood groups, the Denver Medical Association, any kind of environmental group I could find. I actually
So it's
I have a list of
tool.
them. Yeah, I took it to a lot of neighborhood groups. I identified neighborhood groups as being important, medical groups as being important. I took it to Sierra Club and every environmental group in town. I have a list of them someplace. But I took it to 100 groups during those 2-year periods. And so this was real one-on-one organizing. In 1980...
And all of this was on a volunteer basis?
Yes, unpaid. My husband was working. We had a funky little home. At some point we moved into this house. And we lived very moderately, but I had the fire in my belly. May we stop for just a minute?
Yes.
Thank you.
We're picking up again, and do you want to just start?
Yes.
Where are you?
I'm working in the American Friends Service Committee. It's 1985, 86. About 1986, late in the summer, there was an announcement that the plant was going to initiate fluidized bed incineration of mixed radioactive wastes. I guess this was an old technology, but a new use for it because they'd never incinerated mixed radioactive waste, which are things like clothes and materials that are impregnated with radionuclides like uranium-239 and also carbon tetrachloride and all kinds of stuff. And so a fluidized bed incinerator burned at 1,000 degrees, but it was kind of a smokeless, flameless, chemical reaction kind of technology. And this was the beginning of a new era. This was really a seminal point in the movement of picking up what was wrong at nuclear weapons plants and how the public could interact.
And how was it advertised? How did it get out to the public that this was going to happen?
It may have been mentioned at one of the monthly monitoring committee meetings held jointly between the Colorado Health Department and the plant. The EPA may have been attending those meetings by that time. I don't recall. And perhaps there was then a small piece in the newspaper, because by this era, the Denver Post at least had assigned a reporter to be in some of the Rocky Mountain News. So we had two competing head-to-head very successful newspapers in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post. We were one of the few newspaper cities in the United States where there were still two newspapers, so that was utilized to our advantage down the road. And I defended both those reporters, and not only did I plant stories in those two papers through those reporters, but things that were dropped off to them anonymously by reporters were given to me with a promise I would never tell the source. So the journalists at that time, whose names I will not mention, but who are both active, successful journalists, not living in the Denver area anymore, helped me by giving me documents. So whistleblowing was not public, but it was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So the incineration issue came up at the same time, about late 1986. The town fathers in the areas around the plant, which Superior, which had 300 people at that time, but now has tens of thousands of people, Westminster and Arvada, really wanted to develop the property immediately to the east and south of the plant, kind of prime real estate, and the population was booming. So they wanted a new highway to go in called W470, which would have been an expansion of the C470 corridor. It would have run south and east of the plant through some of the most heavily contaminated soil. I right away was extremely concerned about that because my vision was for these big tractors, big earth movers, moving up all this dust and dirt that had soil particles in it, and when they stirred up what had been kind of patted down into the ground and rooted with root systems, the soil would be disturbed, the whole soil system would be disturbed, and it would be like almost having an accident with all the soil from the construction being stirred up, plus bringing the population closer to the plant. So there were two issues on the burner by the end of 1986. The fluidized bed incinerator, which had never been used before for mixed nuclear or mixed radioactive chemical waste, and W470. So I very innocently proposed a meeting co-sponsored by the AFSC to have a town meeting in the Arvada City Hall about these two issues. And I did go to the newspapers, and this hasn't been on. Oh, that's it, not on.
I think it is. It's just.
Uh-oh. Should I just repeat a little bit of that, or?
I think we can
Okay.
pick it up.
Okay. So the beginning of January of 1987 was a very seminal year. Lots happened that year. We knew that we had the development of proposed development of W470 highway corridor on the horizon, and the instigation of fluidized bed incineration at the plant for the mixed radioactive hazardous waste. An old technology on a totally new, highly toxic, highly radioactive, huge amount of material at the plant. The plant at this time was having waste problems. They had all this waste out there. They had the high-level waste, which was ultimately destined for Yucca Mountain in the far reaches of Nevada, and the low-level waste was all going to be shipped to the waste isolation pilot project down near Carlsbad Cavern in New Mexico. But neither of those were up and running yet. They were having a lot of problems with them. So waste is stacking up the plant with no place to go. So their idea was to incinerate. Well, incineration is a really good issue to organize a political movement around, it turns out. I guess this had been done earlier at Berkeley when the nuclear labs out at Berkeley were going to incinerate. We were very innocent at this time, though, but I had all kinds of flags raised with incineration because we're talking about burning, we're talking about what do those HEPA filters let out and what do they keep in. So we innocently proposed a meeting in January of 1987 at the Arvada Performing Arts Center. And one of my sympathetic newspaper reporter contacts got a little story about this meeting put in, I believe, the Denver Post. So we had some advance coverage, and the night of the meeting was absolutely incredible. We had it in a fairly medium-sized room, maybe for 50 people. We must have had 250 people show up. People were packed. They were hanging from the rafters. They were flowing out the doors, out the front door, out the back door. The news media came. We had reporters there. I think we even had a TV station show up. All because of this one little article in the newspaper. Never underestimate the power of a media, a sympathetic media. And so we laid out our two issues. One was soil disturbance and nuclear particulates being stirred up into the atmosphere with a lot of disturbance of construction with the W470 corridor. Our second argument that we laid out that night was the problems around incineration. That there could be low-level but continuous releases with burning through the HEPA filters, and that if there were another accident, such as we had in 1957 or in 1969, we could have a catastrophic release of radionuclides over the greater Denver area. The Denver population had tripled by this time and was much closer to the plant because Denver was a beautiful place to live. Boulder was a beautiful place to live. Broomfield was a beautiful place to live. Broomfield was drawing water, by the way, from Great Western Reservoir, and it was fed by creeks that ran through Rocky Flats, picking up all the carbon tetrachloride impregnated with impregnated with carbon tetrachloride and radionuclides. So holding ponds had been put in, but we had water problems as well as airborne problems. We highlighted the two issues of incineration in the highway at that meeting, and it was a roller coaster ride after that. It was just a roller coaster ride. At one point, so in 19...
Do you remember, did you run that meeting, or did you...
Yes, I think I was. Maybe Tom Rao was with me. I think I ran the meeting, did the agenda, and I mean, we had people yelling from the... It kind of got out of control. It was first the out-of-control meetings, incensed public. And there were enough people there that the politicians started to notice. After that, a woman I may have met at that meeting who called me up after that meeting, named Joan Seaman, who lived in Westminster, and I got together. Joan Seaman was a flamboyant, colorful woman who had studied drama. She was at home raising her two children, and she was freaked out because she had gotten a homeowner's notice that was being given out by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, something like that, about the fact that she lived near a nuclear weapons plant, and there was the potential for an accident. And I guess they handed it out to people just briefly for a year or two who lived within a 10-mile radius of the plant, letting them know there were some problems. And that was discontinued because it was unpopular with developers, town fathers, and the health department turned it over to FEMA, or FEMA turned it over to the health department. It got discontinued after about a year. But she got one of those notices, and it set fire under her feet. She didn't even know she was living next to a nuclear weapons plant. She called me up. We went out for tea, and we decided to form our own citizens group called CARFCA, Citizens Against Rocky Flats Contamination. And Joan and I were foot soldiers. We leafleted on foot all the neighborhoods around the plant. We leafleted them with a one-page flyer about the problems, the incineration, W470, the long-term issues. We leafleted them about upcoming meetings. We rang doorbells and talked to people. One day we went into Plutonium, which was a home developer developing near the plant, and we posed as prospective home buyers, innocent, naive housewives with children looking to buy property in the area. We asked them a lot of questions, and then we asked the kicker, is there anything we should know about any hazardous stuff around here, anything we should know about? Any kinds of plants doing anything toxic? And they said, oh, no. They lied. The other time that was a very provocative moment for me, this same year, was meeting with someone who both worked at Rocky Flats and was on the Jefferson County Health Board. Gary, can't remember his last name, maybe that's good for an oral history, who knew what was going on at Rocky Flats. There was a real conflict of interest, in my estimation, for him to be working at Rocky Flats. He had a medical background, perhaps he was an MD, or some kind of a PhD, but he was working as a health physicist or doing health monitoring at Rocky Flats, and he also served on a Jefferson County Health Board, who ultimately oversaw the activities of Dr. Carl Johnson and could hire him or fire him. And this gentleman stood up to me at a meeting when I cited an actual government document about radionuclides being in the ponds and certain releases, and an actual CARP document that the plant was forced to put out as part of its long-range planning. And he said that was not true when it was in their own documents. He actually stood up and called me a liar. He didn't call me a liar, but he said that is a distruth, that is not true, when I had the document published by the Department of Energy in my hands. And that's when I knew that responsible local citizens, town fathers, patriarchs, could be liars. And it was David against Goliath. And if there hadn't been a fire in my belly before then, to be called a liar when I had done my research and I had documented proof, was the beginning of the battle. I took that document to both the Post and News. I sat down with those reporters and I went through it line by line with them, and we discussed the implications of current contamination at the plant and what had been either covered up or not publicized. And because of my media background, I knew these things about doing media work. You have to be honest, you have to know when the time is right to strike, and you have to be impeccable in the documents and the facts you present for reporters, or you lose your credibility. And one of my breaks with the NIMBYs, the high-end, high-voiced, name-calling activists who were coming online at that time, was that they sometimes did their homework, but they twisted what came out of documents, they quoted them out of context, they exaggerated, and they were not good media sources.
And these would be, the people you're referring to would be the people in the neighborhood that were very upset.
Well, there was another group that kind of sprang up that were, you know, calling Governor Rover and anybody at the plant a Nazi, and were really very vocal and very scary to me, and they did get a lot of media attention, but I didn't feel that they were doing accurate and professional journalism and public relations. And it was an issue for me because they encroached on my credibility with the media because I got associated with them. And that's probably as much as I want to say about them. But they got a lot of attention. They did bring up legitimate issues. Neil Schoenbeck, in a book that was written about this period, felt they had a legitimate role in the democratic process because they scared the hell out of politicians and everybody else, and really were right up in people's faces. I didn't like anybody being called a Nazi. I mean, we had people who were doing very bad things to our local populations, but they were not Nazis. And I felt there was a better and more professional way to do things, and that may have come out of my professional training. But my role was to work with the media and to serve as a liaison between the very detailed, factual, scientific documents being produced, and later as a liaison with the scientists I put together as the Boulder Scientist Group, and also to be an educator in the community, and to perfect the soundbite when the media came to us ready to cover the story. So those were my roles in this. And I hope I don't sound too arrogant. I hope I can say this with humility. I was one person, and there were many different kinds of activists. Some of these people were the cultural activists who used drama and art and craziness to make a statement culturally. There were the quiet, big-time strategists like Pam Solo. There were the really experienced activists and political organizers like Maury Wolfson. There were people like me who were the media people, the communicators. I saw that as my role. So we all had our role in this, and we all came together at the right moment in history and created a critical mass. That's a word from the plan itself. Critical mass causes a criticality. You've got a big problem. But we had a critical political mass and a critical media mass, and that's when the education of the community began to happen. That's when the middle class, the people who owned property and paid taxes and voted, got on the bandwagon. The people who made a difference, the middle class got on, and this became their issue. It became a mainstream issue. And that's why we were able to go as far as we were with this movement. The plant did not, I feel, ultimately close down and stop producing weapons in 1991 because of us. It was because of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But our part was to educate the public about the high cost of nuclear weapons production and about secrecy in our government in the name of national defense. Our role was to educate the public about the health costs and the environmental costs and the cost of the democratic process of the way things were conducted by the Department of Energy. And we succeeded admirably in that role. Is this a good time to break?
Let's break now.
Because
this is a continuation of the oral history with Jan Pilcher, and I forgot to give today's date before. This is October 21st, 2005. So, do you want to just pick up where you were?
Yeah. Well, as I said, 1987 was a seminal year, and there were a number of developments during that period that were extremely important for the ultimate closure of the plant. One is that I realized we needed, and as a media person, I needed to have solid, legitimate, science-based information to feed the media. And at all these public meetings and monitoring meetings I had been going to, I had run into a number of prominent great scientists. There was, of course, Dr. Carl Johnson, but there was a wonderful, wonderful man at INCAR, Dr. Ed Martell, who was a nuclear chemist. And he had a protege named Niels Schombeck, who taught at Metro State College, whose background was
Biochemistry.
Biochemistry. There was a quiet man always in the back of the audience who didn't say much, that turned out to have a PhD in meteorology, which was a very important component of our arguments. And there was a molecular biologist from the University of Colorado, an Englishman, whose name I will remember in a minute. And I pulled them all together without pay, without recompensation, without any glory, and said, we need a Boulder scientist group, they were all living in the Boulder area, to review these documents and to decide what's important, what's not, and to release statements to the public. And they went after it with zest and enthusiasm. I see it much like probably it was during the Trinity Project, when you drew together the great scientists of the world and had them brainstorm. And this was a Boulder group brainstorming on really serious local issues. And I was simply I wasn't the brain, but I brought them together, and I was the note taker at these meetings, and I asked questions, and I kept minutes, and I wrote press releases, but they did all the work absolutely without compensation. They took time off after work. We met for like 4 to 6 in the evening, once every week or two, and they generated fabulous information. One of them was actually a Denverite, Joe Goldfield, who was a World War II veteran. He had come out of MIT, and he helped design HEPA filters, which are the critical component at Rocky Flats to protect the public from contamination. They're a series of kind of paper filters that filter out small particles that have radionuclides in them. But if there's a fire, it burns right through them. If there's a small rip or tear, things get released. And they don't filter out gases and vapors, such as uranium hexafluoride. So there were a whole range of issues that were more technical than we who were really peace activists and anti-nuclear protesters knew about. So they gave us substance and legitimacy. And they were wonderful men. They were fueled by ethics and a real genuine concern for their country and for good science, and for good science being made open to public scrutiny. And it was my pleasure and my blessing to work with them, and they really moved our movement forward. Joe Goldfield in particular, because he had a background in the development of HEPA filters during World War II, was able to write extremely detailed critiques of the plant's plan to incinerate, with all the minor things that could happen, like tears, leaks, major fires, day-to-day emissions releases because of vapors and things that the HEPA filters can't catch. And he was wonderful. He's gone now. We lost him to cancer, and he's one of my heroes. Ed Martell is gone now, too. He used to let me come up and visit him at his office up in INCAR, up above Boulder, where he was doing all kinds of innovative research. And he always said, Jan, you need to go back to school and to get a degree in nuclear chemistry, which I knew I wasn't going to do, but he loved science. And he primed me in nuclear chemistry. He taught me in a one-on-one seminar, a graduate-level seminar about nuclear chemistry, so that I could understand the issues. My heart goes out to him, too. He was in his last years in near retirement, probably working past retirement, and he would meet with us. He would clear out his desk and his schedule to meet with the activists for an hour or two and to tell us what it meant and what was going on. And he called the DOE and the plant managers on their bluff. He knew how much plutonium was in the soil out there, perhaps 10 tons, I can't remember the number. He turned out to be right on when the plant dismissed him. But he had earlier done work and collaborated with him, so he really knew what was going on out there. He knew what was under the 903 pads, and he knew how much he could quantify the amount of plutonium. He was perhaps my most important educator. The Boulder Scientist Group was tremendously important in this movement. And I give them profound thanks and gratitude. And I think it's a lesson for future movements. You have to have access to good, responsible, legitimate scientists, and your information has to be factually and scientifically correct. And we were lucky to have their generosity in this movement. The other thing is we didn't have any money. My little funky organization that I founded with Joan Seaman had 1,000 people in it. But 1,000 people wrote 1,000 letters. And this is the value of one in a democracy. You get one letter and they may not pay attention. They get 10 now, so I've heard there are 10 emails and they pay attention. You get 20 and you have a criticality. Well, we had 1,000 letters flood the governor's office, to flood David Skaggs, who was the state representative at the time. We had them flood his office. People were calling on the phones. People were yelling at legislators. People were following them around at public meetings.
And this was mainly around the incineration.
Incineration was the igniting issue. This went on. We had another big public meeting in May of that year. All kinds of things went on. But we got Sierra Club. I went and I did a presentation to Sierra Club, and Eugene someone was the head of Sierra Club, or at least the Toxics Committee of Sierra Club. I later became the state co-chairman of the Toxics Committee of Sierra Club. I joined it because I realized it was a valuable organization. We were able to go on a lobbying trip to Washington, D.C. and to meet with a wonderful young woman there who had worked with the woman in Oklahoma City, Karen
Silkwood?
Karen Silkwood. So she had a background and she knew about secrecy and where it led to. And she came out and she worked with us and filed a lawsuit on behalf of CARFCA, and perhaps the Rocky Mountain Peace Center was involved too, but definitely CARFCA and Sierra Club locally were the co-claimants on a lawsuit to prevent incineration, and she claimed they were violating environmental laws. And so we were able at least to temporarily shut down the proposed incineration until more studies were done. But at this point, I think we probably had the plant worried because we had some big guns. It wasn't just funky little local activists. We had some money coming in and some legal expertise from Washington, D.C. in the form of Sierra Club. So this was another significant prong of the movement progressing forward in 1987. And then,
do you think the Sierra Club got involved because of the incineration issue, or do you know?
yes, but they got involved because of Eugene, local person who was an optometrist, and just it was an issue at that time. It was becoming a mainstream issue, not only in Colorado, but in the United States. And I will say, in my media work, I played off one newspaper against another. Later on, I went to both newspapers just before deadline and dropped on their desk a press release I had just written talking about the fact that there were not enough fire alarms and that there were non-operative fire alarms and criticality alarms in a number of buildings. It was just buried in the back of a 1,000-page budget request document that somebody at Greenpeace found and called me on. And they both carried stories the next day, so we played papers off. But I realized that this was a national story. And because I had done national media work for the ski industry, innocent ski industry, I was bold enough to call the New York Times. And I think Matthew Wald was on the nuclear and environmental beat by that time. There may have been somebody before him. But I fed him all of our press releases. I talked with him at length for hours on the phone. I tracked down a local journalist for AP who was a kind of a very well-seasoned long-term journalist who had gotten her start in Vietnam. Her name was Tabitha Bartimus. And I sat down with her for hours and fed her documents. And she later wrote a whole book about it called Trinity's Children. But she talked about all the nuclear establishments along the nuclear highway, which is I-25, beginning with all the missile silos up in Wyoming and northern Colorado, coming down to Rocky Flats, going down to Los Alamos, and then ending up with all the old nuclear weapons storage outside of Albuquerque. It's a good book. So people were coming at it from a lot of different directions, but it did not hurt to have the New York Times start looking at the issue and carrying national coverage, because the U.S. Senate and Congress read the New York Times. So that was important. So my part in it was media at this time in history, and I followed in footsteps in a team with all these other activists. But the media got us a lot further along. And being bold enough to take it to the national media. And then to look at Savannah River and to start calling up activists in Savannah River and calling up activists in Pantex, Texas, and calling up activists at the Idaho National Testing Area.
And you did that?
Well, I did it, and
And
Jason Salzman with Greenpeace did it, and maybe some people at the Rocky Flats Peace Center did it. And then there was a man out of the Northwest around, probably got to start at Hanford, who actually put together a whole national coalition of nuclear activists and got grant money to take us to Washington, D.C. to educate staff people in all the congressional offices who were working on environmental and nuclear issues. And we particularly began to highlight health issues, and particularly health issues of the workers. Because the workers are the canaries in the caves, because they were the people to get the most contamination and would be right on the front lines. And if they were having health issues, and they were, brain cancer and higher levels of cancer in general, then we could extrapolate to nearby populations. The other thing I did when I talked about going out and talking to 100 groups is I'd done some lobbying by this point, so I knew how to prepare a one-page briefing sheet for very busy legislators who needed it fast and in 5 minutes and in bullet form. And I went to David Skaggs and Sam Williams, a really visionary leader, a black living in Breckenridge, a ski area, who was so interested in this issue. He was a former military man too, by the way, but he pulled together an investigative legislative committee at the Colorado Assembly to look at this issue, to look at Rocky Flats specifically, and gave us a lot of his time and really educated himself on this issue. I sat down and talked at length with David Skaggs when he was still at the state before he moved to the National Congress, and gave him all my briefing papers, and he sat down, and he had a background as a lawyer, and he asked me really tough questions and grilled me. I must have spent 2 or 3 hours with David Skaggs, really giving him the lowdown.
And this was before he was the representative from that
Before
district.
he was at the U.S. Congress. He was in the state Congress, because I went right down to the Capitol building and sat in a chair in his office for 2 or 3 hours. So I took it there. I took it to city council people, too. I went and I briefed city council people, and so when we had the incineration issue, we realized that one of the strong areas we needed to hit hard were city council people who lived in areas around the plant. So we had a letter writing campaign, and CARFCA, my little citizens group, got 18,000 signatures on petitions saying they absolutely refused to tolerate incineration in their neighborhoods. And we sent those petitions to all the city councils and to the state legislature. And
I think it'll be picking it up anyway.
so working at the state legislative level was another really important prong in this movement at this time. The letter writing campaigns, 18,000 people signing a signature saying we will not tolerate incineration in our community, at least until we have long-term studies on the health impacts, which have never been done, until you can develop a worst-case scenario about a burn or a criticality of the plant with all those HEPA filters burning right through, until you can tell us what the daily releases are going to total up to in terms of slow but continuous health impacts. We will not tolerate this incineration beginning here. So we requested those things. We educated our state elected senators and representatives. We educated city council people. We educated the local journalists. We educated neighborhoods. We went out to neighborhoods and we talked to people. And we had this little funky slideshow, and we leafleted the neighborhoods. And then, of course, Sierra coming in big guns and filing the lawsuit against the incineration and stalling it helped. And then there was another wonderful thing that happened. When I was going through the files at the American Friends Service Committee, which was in a very funky building down near Colfax, I found a paper by somebody who was like Cassandra. He knew about all this stuff before it happened, and he knew there were going to be long-term impacts with what we were going to do with all this waste. And his name was Robert Alvarez. He was a staffer for a congressional committee, and he was considered kind of one of the congressional experts on the nuclear weapons complex and its difficulties. I read this absolutely amazing paper by him that laid out in great detail all the problems that we are now in the year 2000 facing in terms of where is the storage going to go long term and how are we going to get rid of it and what were the long-term impacts and what do you do with these plants after you dismantle them. Do you cement them over and leave all the waste on site, or do you take the precarious measures of trucking it and training it to other sites where there are fewer people living, but where it could be equally contaminating? One site being Yucca Mountain, which is in a fault zone for the high-level waste. The other site being the WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in New Mexico, which is right above an aquifer for a major river. I think it's the Pecos River. And you don't know what happens when all those radionuclides burn through their metal containers. It'll last maybe for a millennia, but not more. So all these questions were coming up. Robert Alvarez had written about them 10 years earlier, though. Nobody had read this paper. I pulled it out, I read it, And I loaned it to a graduate student who promptly lost it. So I called Bob in Washington. I tracked him down working in a congressional office. He had no more copies of that paper. But I was able to go back to Washington, D.C. on a business trip. My husband was doing public policy at that time. And I called him up. He knew me from no one. I said, may I have 2 hours of your time? And I interviewed him, and I have it all on a tape that I still have in my bedroom. And it was another seminal moment in my life because he outlined not only all the long-term environmental issues and the ways things would not be resolved because the country didn't have the technology yet, but he outlined for me the first time the fact that we needed to work in coalition with the workers at the plant. Mm-hmm. The workers at the plant were the first people to have the health effects. The workers at the plant were our friends because we needed to work together to have legislation regarding monitoring and tracking health impacts. We needed to have more epidemiological studies. We needed to do more off-site monitoring and testing. And we needed to include the EPA and the health department as responsible parties. We needed to have funds promised to us for Superfund cleanups. And we needed to go out and start a dialogue with the workers, which is precisely what I did. He came out on at least 3 or 4 visits. He was a house guest in my own home, I'm privileged to say. I drove him all over. We would go out to the plant and interview workers and those people at the plant who were working on health monitoring. And he was a civilized, dignified man who knew how to work with what we considered the enemy. And he taught me they were our friends. And that was a new step forward in this for a compassionate and unified movement that included all of America and not just segments of America. He was an amazing, amazing man, and he's another of my mentors. And I'm so grateful he flew out here on his own time and gave us his weekends and his afternoons and his evenings. And I mean, he was putting in 12 and 14-hour days here, meeting with groups, meeting with legislators, meeting with everybody. And he had...
his position was actually within the Department of Energy, or?
No, his department was with Congress.
Congress.
He worked with a Congressional Research Committee, and his specialty was nuclear weapons complex. And he later went on to do research for the Department of Energy, and I think he's with us, a think tank now. He was a real intellectual. He had been working on it for a long, long time. He was one of the early people who identified all the problems and probably was talking to small groups in Washington before groups were really organized around the plants and in nearby cities and affected communities. Before the local movements got started, he was already working on this. And he was a real expert in the field. So he came and he loaned us his expertise. So we had legal help from the outside. We began having political input from the outside. We had Robert Alvarez from Washington, D.C. coming in, and we had the Boulder Scientist Group. And we had a hell of a lot of public meetings. And it was a very, very exciting time. And we were able to stall and ultimately to stop incineration. That was a victory. Mm-hmm. W470 has never been built. Mm-hmm. A large buffer zone, as I said, was already built around the plant. During the 1980s, at some time, maybe 1983, the attorney Howard Holm settled with all the people around, the big homeowners around the plant. There was a $10 million settlement. And so they were quietly drifted away because they had their money. During the late 80s, at the time I was working with the Citizens Against Rocky Flats Contamination, Glenna Smith, a homeowner up, living I believe in Arvada, began a homeowners group up there. There were several groups. There was a women's group that wore blue ribbons to represent clean skies and clean air and a non-contaminated plutonium-free childhood for their children. So there was a kind of splinter mothers group, and then Glenna Smith started a citizens group that ultimately filed a lawsuit on behalf of something like 60,000 neighbors up in that area who were property owners who feared their property values plummeting. And I don't think that lawsuit has ever been ultimately resolved. Bruce Dubosky was involved in it, and someone I'm currently working with at the University of Denver named Bob Golan worked on it. There were a lot of lawyers coming in doing pro bono work, but by now it was mainstream. Property owners were involved, mothers were involved, and to be quite frank, I found mothers the most effective lobbying and organizing group at meetings. They were the ones who cared about the health of their children and cared about their families. And they went out door to door and they had teas and coffees and they came to meetings and they really went after the health issue. So it was mothers and who cared about their families in neighborhoods that were a really potent force in this movement. I mean, that was female power. That was pretty astonishing. We had the patriarchy representing politics and government, and probably the legal community, and they got on board. But it was mothers, and I was a mother too. I was a mother, and I was a child who had grown up in the Cold War, probably with what was post-traumatic stress syndrome from the Cold War, like everybody else who was a baby boomer who grew up during the Cold War. So I was a mother and a child of the Cold War, and you know, these were emotional issues for us. Yeah. And we had to learn how to transform them into issues that could be dealt with on a political issue, which I think we successfully did, because we worked together. All these leaders with their different talents worked in a coalition.
You must have put in many, many long hours. How did you manage that with?
Oh, I think it had a strain on my family. My 3 young children didn't see me a lot. I was at meetings at night a lot, because this was a thing where we did meetings at night when people got off work. And frankly, people would call at 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock at night. Usually those were the crazies. And I remember being on the phone well past midnight. I don't remember seeing much of my husband. Somebody must have learned how to cook, because it wasn't me. And it's funny because none of my 3 older children are really activists, but they did see that happening. I think my youngest, who was born in the thick of all this in 1989, and I remember having such a sense of euphoria. She was born in April, and in the fall of 1989, November 9th of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. So I saw the end of the Cold War in my lifetime, and I have a little chunk of the Berlin Wall out in the kitchen embedded in glass. But the Berlin Wall came down, and Rocky Flats quit producing nuclear weapons that same fall. And I had a real sense of euphoria that we were on the cusp of world peace and the end of forever of nuclear weapons production. What a time and a place in history for a child to be born. I'm since sobered up, because we have North Korea producing nuclear weapons, probably Iran is producing nuclear weapons. A lot of nuclear material got out of the Soviet Union that was undocumented and not well protected, that got over borders and provided nuclear material to rogue states. And I think perhaps the times we face now are scarier than any times we faced during the Cold War. And it's a real sobering time to be raising children, because I won't be alive when a nuclear bomb may detonate, or it may detonate in my lifetime in an act of terrorism by people who don't care about the long-term survival of humanity. And so I think these are very precarious times. So my youngest, who was born in a time of euphoria and great celebration, may be the political activist. And I have fear for my children. I have to say, there was a wonderful article published when she was 3 or 4 months old and still a babe in my arms. We were sitting outside in a flower garden in the sunshine, and a picture appeared in the Denver Post about nuclear activist Jan Pilcher holding her youngest and only true biological child in her arms, with the wish that she would someday become an activist. And it was a big picture with a big cut line in the Denver Post. I guess it was because I had friends in the newspaper business, and so that's in the front of her baby book, with this wonderful euphoric entry about my daughter was born in an amazing era, the end of nuclear weapons production and the end of the Cold War. So those were things that happened during that time. I was crazy enough. I quit during a very difficult time. I quit. I retired in February of 1989, the year my daughter was born. I was very pregnant. I needed 2 months to actually address my house, which hadn't been dug out in several years, and to make a baby room and buy a crib, and things were really hot and heavy, and it was a hard time to retire. There was a lot of fracturing in the movement at that time between the mainstream activists, the old anti-nuclear activists who wanted world peace and wanted the end of weapons production, and then there was this angry other group rising up and calling people names, and kind of a splinter from the movement, and doing really crazy saboteuring type acts that I don't think helped the movement. And they got a lot of media, which they enjoyed, and I retired just as I think things got a little nasty. In June of 1989, with a brand new baby in my arms, a fleet of FBI agents invaded the plant in a raid. and went through all the files in the plant and pulled their CD discs, and then been doing overnight flights with ultra-red technology to find out if they were doing midnight burning, which I think they were. They were operating those fluidized bed incinerators when they said they weren't. They had been doing incineration for years when they said they weren't. And so they invaded the plant and they took all these records. And then there was a grand jury investigation after that, which has been kind of muffled. And you probably have other people recounting that end of the story. And it was with great regret and sadness and kind of a crazed feeling that I turned down international reporters calling me here at home, wanting interviews and wanting me to come out and meet with them. And I had a brand new baby that was 3 weeks old, and I had no sleep, and I was not able, my family intruded. And that was, you know, I could see history happening, and I didn't get to be part of it, so I was really sad. But so that...
You had no knowledge of the FBI raid before it happened,
No,
did you?
no. No, so that was pretty amazing. I had journalists calling me on the phone, hysterical, and saying, do you realize the FBI is in waves arriving at the plant right now and invading and putting on, you know, radioactive suits to go into hot areas, and they're pulling records out of computers and they're going into files. Do you realize this is happening right now? And I later saw a movie called, I think, Mississippi Burning or something, about the FBI agents arriving in squads down in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and it put chills up and down my spine because the same thing happened here in 1989. I mean, it was it was federal and government turning in on itself after it had said for years that they were protected by secrecy for the cause of protecting the world, and then they were invading the plant, and it was a wild, historic time. And there were other people who you were interviewing who will fill in that, because I had this baby. About a year and a half, about a year later, I was recruited by Physicians for Social Responsibility to head up their Colorado office. Ken Lichtenstein, had a Denver infectious disease specialist, an MD, who has a large AIDS practice, was voted the national president of this well-funded group of physicians who cared about social issues. And they were riding high after having been awarded the Nobel Prize a few years earlier, along with the Soviet Union's sister counterpart. And it was too tempting. So I took an ill-paid part-time position, which of course turned out to be full-time, as all part-time positions are. I took over from Laurel Lefkowitz, who had started working on Rocky Flats, and they dumped a lot of money into this as their main and primary program. So stopping the production of nuclear weapons, or starting Rocky Flats from restarting, and really going after the medical impacts of weapons production and the environmental impacts that could lead to health hazards were its primary goals. And I was in the right place at the right time. It was very exciting. I did not do this alone. I was a one-person office. I was the director of the Colorado office. But I worked with a lot of backup from the national office, and they had resources there in terms of researchers who went through all the documents coming out of the DOE and the budget requests with a fine-tooth comb, and they had legal money. And then we had the wonderful Jason Salzman from Greenpeace here. We had Tom Rao at the American Friends Service Committee. We had Leroy Moore up in Boulder with the Rocky Flats Peace Committee, Peace Center. Who else were regulars? Those were the important regulars. And then there were these little citizen groups budding that were involved in the legal action stirring up in Arvada and Westminster. Bruce Dubosky, the attorney, was still hot and heavy on this case. He represented nuclear workers who died. He represented widows, including Betty Grable, whose husband had died of brain cancer. And so he was doing lawsuits, and he was very, very good on health issues. Boulder Scientist Group was still around at that time. Neil Schoenbeck was still very active. By this time, the EPA was involved. Nat Miulo at the EPA was going after this. So we had the EPA involved. The health department was shaking the money tree to fund studies to really go after Rocky Flats, and they hired John Till, the national expert on kind of soil issues, to come in and do measurements and do radiometrics. And EPA funded a monitoring committee here, and it was another bedazzling, exciting time. That was the time when Rocky Flats was looking at reopening. And I have this press release that I just discovered minutes ago calling for a town meeting on the restart of Rocky Flats in May of 1991 at the Thornton City Hall. And we were going to go after our city officials and reclaim our democratic rights in a free and open society to question our officials about how they could reopen a plant when there were so many unanswered questions. And some of those questions were that there was a critical plant-wide fire and security alarm systems deterioration. Fire alarms weren't working. There was a criticality alarm deficiency there. If there was a criticality in a mass explosion and radionuclides were released from the stacks, there was still no emergency plan in place for the whole community. Can you believe it? And this is before 9/11 and before the unimaginable could be imaginable. But we wanted to know what the unimaginable would be here locally. There were 62 pounds of plutonium found in the ductwork. How did plutonium get in the ductwork and out through some of the layers of plutonium filters? Well, when the ducts got clogged up, the workers who were working in glass boxes with lead-lined rubber gloves would take their screwdrivers through their lead-lined rubber gloves and poke up where the ducts were clogged. And of course, when they poked up there with their screwdrivers, they poked through some of the HEPA filters, so some of the plutonium got into the ductwork. And one of the nightmares today, as they are dismantling all the buildings where they actually built nuclear weapons that were very, very contaminated, like Building 771, they had huge amounts of plutonium in the ductwork because of these breaches of manufacturing. So we had that issue, 62 pounds, and it turned out to be a lot more. We found out later on when the ductwork were not going to be completely removed before they reopened the plant. We wanted to know where all the existing waste generated was going to go, since neither WHIP was open nor Yucca Mountain, and what they were going to do with all the waste accumulating. Actually, they had kind of tents out there with waste accumulated in these big tents on the plant site. And of course, the mayor of Idaho, by now other states were involved, and Cecil Andrus, the governor of Idaho, was out there standing on the railroad tracks refusing for trains from Rocky Flats loaded with mixed radioactive waste. He was refusing, and he was calling out the National Guard from his state. He was refusing to let those train loads filled with waste from Rocky Flats enter his state and go up to the Idaho National Engineering Lab. It was a bizarre, crazy, riveting time. So they wanted to reopen Rocky Flats in the midst of all this. And we had now an informed citizenry. I mean, the cat was out of the bag. We had the scientists, we had the lawyers, we had the educated legislators and educated city council people. I don't think they were going to reopen that plant. We also wanted a criticality statement from them. We wanted to know all these things. So American Friends Service Committee, Greenpeace with the wonderful Jason Salzman, Colorado Physicians for Social Responsibility, my organization, the Rocky Mountain Peace Center, and that would be Leroy Moore, and the Rocky Mountain Sane Freeze. I don't know if Pam Solo was still here then, it was somebody else, worked together in coalition on this. That town meeting was a disaster, though. The Rocky Flats workers heard about the meeting and they packed the facility. And we made a huge mistake because we didn't read our audience. We had effigies with glitter on them of the politicians who were too afraid to show up, sitting in seats with plaques in front of them with their names on them. We had them on effigies, though. But it looked to very conservative Rocky Flats workers who were about to lose their jobs when the plant shut down. It looked to them like we were making fun. We were mocking our elected officials. That was a huge mistake. That's where using the part of the leadership that's into arts and culture and drama can blow up in your face. That was a very difficult meeting to run. The plant workers shouted us down. We had an agenda.
Were you running the meeting?
I and Jason Salzman were running the meeting, and we had to take it full frontal, as they say. They shouted us down at the meeting.
Uh-huh. Did you anticipate this at all? Or
we didn't know. There was an underground movement at the plant through the phone network to call and to pack the place with workers who were mad as hell. So that was a mistake. And although I had learned my lessons well from Robert Alvarez about working in coalition with these workers, they were going to lose their jobs. They had their own unions. The unions packed the plant. And even though lots of work in the end was generated by the cleanup, they didn't know that. Mm-hmm. They also put their own lives at risk and were beginning to understand that they might have cancer in 10 or 20 years, or berylliosis, because beryllium was released at the plant, and a lot of workers were getting something like black lung and dying from berylliosis. And they were afraid. I mean, I have great compassion for them, especially now that I'm older, because they were afraid as well as angry, and they shouted us down at that meeting. And it was a very tough meeting to run. We had a very legitimate agenda. We didn't get through it. But ultimately, the plant closed down. And it's with a mixture of shame and pleasure that I want to end this interview with this image. The Rocky Mountain News carried a front page picture of me celebrating with a glass of champagne with, I believe, Jason Salzman and Tom Rao at a rally at maybe the headquarters at the front steps of the state capitol, where we had many, many political rallies over the years. The ultimate closure of Rocky Flats in 1991. And an inset up in the corner is a dejected union leader who is going to lose his job and has lost the battle. So we won, they lost. The Cold War ultimately ended it all. But it was bittersweet. And I think at the end of 1990, sometime in probably in middle to end of 1992, I left Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I left nuclear politics. I had 4 young children. One was entering high school. I still had a baby who I hadn't spent much time with, who was in preschool, and I was running a big house, and I was losing my mind. And I needed to look at another career that actually paid money. Although, as it turned out, there ended up being a lot of monitoring jobs, and there turned out to be a lot of work for this because federal money poured into here. There were monitoring committees, and the Cold War, there were all kinds of jobs that did open up, but I at that point needed money, and I went back to school and got a master's degree in counseling psychology, and returned to public relations, and ultimately, at this point in time, I work for the University of Denver, and I get to work with emerging leaders from other countries who are graduate students at the University of Denver. And every skill I developed in the almost 20 years, maybe 15 years of really hardcore Rocky Flats work have come to the fore. Public speaking, lobbying, writing, developing press releases and briefings. And in that time, I'm teaching leadership without ever having studied leadership. But in the course of that, I've come to understand that I was a particular kind of leader, and that my particular physical energy and ability on the communications and media front helped the movement. That Pam Solo, with her brilliance in terms of long-term political strategies and seeing where we could go with this in terms of a nuclear freeze. She later received a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work and moved to the East Coast and consults on an international basis, I believe. She had her genius as a leader. Maury Wolfson had his genius as an environmental strategist and as a very good mentor for many, many people. Leroy Moore was brilliant in almost all areas, but he did hardcore research, he did publications, and he brought in all of his skills from the civil rights movement in terms of being a pacifist and speaking truth to power and being at meetings and never losing his cool and mediating with all parties. Jason Salzman came in with his wonderful creative ability. He later wrote a book educating nonprofits, including the anti-nuclear movement, on how to utilize media to its maximum. A book I've used many times, but I gave him some of his initial training. So, but he's gone on and done a lot of national writing, op-ed writing. Tom Rao, quietly with his skills as a pacifist and a mediator and a hardcore worker, continued to work even after I left at the American Friends Service Committee. There was a group I know, Carrie Lair and you were involved in, which was the Colorado Coalition for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We all worked together and we made history. And I think when I die, what I want engraved on my tombstone is that I was part of this beautiful movement. It is the most important work I've done in my life. And I hope that there will be children in succeeding generations who learn from the work we did and the mistakes we made, And the mistakes would involve respecting all parties, even those who appear to be part of the evil, that they are also humans and have as much fear and anger and as passion as we do, and we need to work together to save the planet. Because I do feel in the year 2005 the planet is very endangered and that our work is cut out for us. That's all I have to say.
Okay.